A prisoner pretending to wear women's clothes confidently walked straight out of prison, based solely on his cunning intellect. Incarcerated again, he dyed his uniform green and escaped by pretending to be a medical professional. That's just 2 out of the 4 times he was able to fool the entire legal system. But how did this ordinary family man end up with a life sentence of 144 years? Let's dive into his story to find out how. Stephen J. Russell, famously known as the Con King, was one of America's most notorious prison escape artists. Russell's extraordinary ability to alter his appearance and persona enabled him to swindle over $1 million and execute 4 daring escapes from prison in the 1990s. While his intellect was exceptional, it was often his love-driven foolishness that resulted in him escaping from prison time and again. Stephen was born on September 14, 1957, in the Tidewater area of Virginia, raised by his adoptive parents alongside an older brother. He was quite involved in the family's fruit distribution business. Stephen had a regular childhood until he discovered he was adopted. Not knowing how to cope with this information, he began to get into trouble at school, so his adoptive parents placed him in a juvenile correctional facility known as Hanover Boys School. It was here that he experienced his first sexual contact. Russell also honed other life skills that lend him great leverage in his adult life. He could read people and situations and then manipulate them to his advantage. This became his most powerful tool. This skill, combined with his intelligence, would become the key ingredient of his future escapades. But Russell did not enjoy the confines of the correctional facility at all. So, he escaped the correctional facility on May 13, 1971, on Friday. Note that date. This isn't the last time you'll hear this. Once he escaped, he started to abide by the laws and even joined the police. In 1976, he married Debbie, a police secretary, and they started a family. Stephen became a model citizen, a devoted husband and father, active in his community, and committed to his job. He even had a daughter, Stephanie, with his wife. But he was harboring his true feelings beneath this facade. After the death of his adoptive father, Thomas Russell, in 1985, he fell into a deep depression. He thought about his life and decided to make some changes in it. He finally confessed his sexuality to his wife, and they eventually parted ways. Russell moved to Houston, Texas. This move was a fresh start for Russell. It was his chance to live openly and authentically, away from the constraints of his past life. He began it by conniving his way into a respectable job while fully embracing his sexuality. He immersed himself in the city's art scene and gay community, enjoying a lavish lifestyle. But obviously, he needed some means to support this lifestyle. Despite having no formal education, Stephen was able to con 3 large companies using false identities when applying for jobs. But his sexual orientation was a liability to his job, as people weren't as accepting back then. But Stephen was obviously not going to give up that easily. He had already tried to make his living legally, but was not treated fairly. So he decided to look for other ways to make big money. After falling on a slick floor and pretending to have a back injury, Russell conned an insurance company out of $45,000. In addition, he also engaged in other minor scams, including selling phony Rolex watches. Since he also faked his documents, he was soon arrested because of multiple fraudulent activities. Stephen's sentence was a mere 6 months behind bars, but he had no intention of fulfilling the sentence. This was his first escape. Steve watched and plotted his getaway for 4 weeks. He took advantage of the guards' 3-hour smoke breaks to become familiar with the prison's routine. He saw that there was no security checks conducted before the guards let visitors in. So he just needed civilian attire and a walkie-talkie for his escape. After landing a job at reception, he was able to enter the rooms where female convicts changed out their civilian clothes before registering. He stole a walkie-talkie, a t-shirt, and women's pants. Once more, on May 13, 1993, Stephen's favorite day, the escape happened. He took the elevator to the bottom floor and waited for the guards to go for their break. There was no reaction from the guards as he walked out. Stephen arrived at the checkpoint. There he used his walkie-talkie to tap on the glass, mimicking a move he'd seen the guards make. Stephen was released by the guards without them even glancing his way. They automatically assumed that he was a civilian. Russell enjoyed the life of freedom for a few days, but 3 days later, he was taken into custody. Without an attorney, Russell represented himself in court and persuaded the judge that he would never flee again. The judge set his bail at $20,000. Surprisingly, Russell paid it right away and fled to another state. Russell was supposed to receive another sentence, but he succeeded in persuading the authorities that he had AIDS, all without providing a single medical certificate. After being extradited back to Texas, Stephen was given a 6-month sentence to serve. This time, Russell decided to complete his full prison sentence. After all, he only had a few months left. It was around this time that he met the love of his life, Philip Morris. They met in the prison library. At first, Russell did not think he would find his true love while being incarcerated. He didn't think the connection would last. Yet, his feelings for Morris grew stronger as their friendship deepened. Stephen wanted to take care of him. With the passage of time, the two lovers fostered a deep bond behind the prison walls. Russell was set free first, and he began planning on finding places for them to settle down. With the help of friends, he cashed out some insurance checks and started putting it together for their new lives. But Stephen wanted to offer Morris a life he had never been able to imagine. So he needed new scams and frauds or a high-paying job to accomplish this. He initially grabbed a job for a while at a grocery shop and meanwhile started searching for jobs at companies that were listed on the Forbes 500 list. He ultimately decided on NAM, a big business that oversees the finances of healthcare groups. All they wanted was a new chief financial officer. Russell cheated the system by posting a job ad with similar specifications in the newspaper, knowing that he required a good resume. He created the impression that his company was seeking new employees. He was flooded with excellent resumes, so he selected the best to serve as a model for his own, which he then forwarded to NAM. He also studied several financial journals and economic textbooks before the interview, paying close attention to the most recent developments in the sector. His charisma, confidence, and command of business jargon left a lasting impression on the company's human resource department. Plus, all of his recommendations were quite complimentary. He placed his resume with the phone numbers of people he claimed were former colleagues. If you were to call any of these numbers, the calls would be forwarded immediately back to Stephen. The proposals were reportedly so compelling that the NAM security team chose not to investigate them further, so they missed the fact that he was a criminal on parole. Russell received a pay raise to CFO when Philip was released from prison, earning $85,000 annually. But even that was not enough for Stephen's desired way of life. He craved an extravagant way of life. He therefore discovered a few extra sources of income. Steve opened brokerage accounts and devised a way to transfer the company's funds through them. It enabled him to utilize that money to gamble on the stock market and preserve the gains for himself. So in his 6 months at NAM, he was able to earn almost $8 million. With the money he and Philip received, they were at last able to lead luxurious lives. Stephen purchased 2 brand new Mercedes and a huge home with a swimming pool in a posh area. He made numerous other luxurious purchases in addition to buying 2 brand new Mercedes for himself and his partner. It goes without saying that such a lavish existence in the public eye could not go unnoticed for long. Had Stephen not acted so stupidly and chosen to refinance their mortgage at a lower interest rate, perhaps everything would have worked out. Russell was called in by the company's managers shortly after the mortgage manager verified his income. His fraudulent activities were caught once again. It's important to note that, in spite of everything, the NAM director noted that Stephen was their finest CFO. And to think that Stephen achieved this by just reading a couple of books. Stephen sensed that something was off, so he bolted from the office and managed to withdraw $40,000 before his accounts were frozen. Authorities assumed that he might flee to another state, but no, he was unable to abandon his lover, Philip Morris. Soon, he was caught again. As he was being taken into custody, he told the police he was diabetic and gave himself multiple injections of insulin. The medicine actually belonged to Philip. Stephen went unconscious and was taken to the hospital. Meanwhile, the couple's bail had been set. After paying the $40,000, Philip freed himself immediately. But because of Stephen's prior criminal history, the judge set his bond at $950,000, which he was unable to pay. Once again, Stephen grasped the opportunity to outsmart the authorities once again. Stephen had basic knowledge of how things work in the judicial system. He knew that the defendant's lawyer fills the form for assigning the bail once it's been set. The judge just signs the form and approves the bail. He reached out to his friends and somehow got his hands on the required form. He filled out the paperwork and reduced his bail to $45,000. This was the amount he could easily afford. But now he had to find a way to get it on the judge's desk. Russell hid the documents beneath his clothes on the day of the hearing. As the court secretary hurriedly carried a stack of documents, he dropped the envelope on the floor, which eventually made its way to the secretary. That evening, pretending to be an authoritative person, Russell called the court and told the night secretary he had a hearing on Stephen Russell's bail that afternoon and that he signed the paper, but the correct details hadn't been uploaded on the system. Once the correct data was uploaded and the bail was reduced, Stephen knew he would soon be free again. On July 13, 1996, Steve called the bail agency and somehow persuaded the clerk to come to his prison to personally pick up the check. When the agency tried to cash the check, it was, of course, fake. But by then, Russell was long gone. As you guessed it, of course, Russell went to Morris. But Morris had already gotten into enough trouble because of Russell. He wanted nothing to do with him. But Russell, being the conniving person he was, convinced Morris to run away with him. The police were on his lead. They knew which people he might reach out to and were tracing his calls. Pretty soon, the police detained him at a hotel. The prosecutor made Russell an offer to enter into a 40-year prison sentence for fraud in order to avoid taking the matter to trial. Everyone was shocked when Stephen accepted the arrangement without hesitation, given how awful it was. But the people who knew him well knew that he did this because he wanted to enter prison so he could leave it as soon as possible. Want to know how he managed to escape for the third time? Steve noticed that the robes of the medical staff and prisoners were almost the same. It's just that the robes of the medical staff were green. So, he hatched an escape plan. He bribed a fellow prisoner and got his hands on an extra set of prison clothes. Next, he bought tons of green felt tip pens from a prisoner who worked at the art studio. The next part was pretty simple. He got down to dyeing the clothes with the green ink. He was nervous if the color was right and whether it would dry properly, but the end result was quite satisfactory. On December 13, 1996, Friday, again Stephen's favorite date, the authorities were fooled once again. Stephen got dressed in his green uniform fairly early in the morning. Then he bravely made his way through the prison yard to the checkpoint. This is the part where a matter of mere seconds decided his fate. For the few seconds that the guard was distracted, Stephen cleverly seized the opportunity to slip through the exit. The woman opened the door without even looking up at him after noticing the color of his clothing. Steve went straight up to the jail gates. Once he escaped, he crossed the street and hid amongst the trees. He walked up to one of the nearest houses and pretended to be a jail physician. Steve explained that he was driving while slightly intoxicated and didn't want to get into any more trouble, which is why he desperately needed the man's help. It's astounding how Stephen managed to convince the man to drive him to the nearest town. From there, Stephen took the cab to another place. As he had no money, he also fooled the taxi driver and didn't pay him at all. Stephen was making sure to put as much distance between himself and the prison, but there was only one direction he could be headed in. Stephen met Morris after many months of separation. Russell again tried convincing him to run away, but that's when Morris finally snapped, resulting in a quarrel. Prior to his encounter with Russell, Philip had complied with the law, but now he had gotten into so much trouble that he had actually become a criminal. However, the fight was short-lived because soon the police were onto them. The couple were detained once more. Poor Philip was found guilty of participating in fraud and given a sentence of 20 years. Russell was given an increased sentence of 45 years as he had managed to escape from the prison. But of course, we know that it wasn't like Stephen to stay put in prison. Let's see what he did this time. Stephen knew that he had escaped from prison way too many times for the authorities to be lenient on him. He was under their watch, so he began to research different loopholes through which he could escape the system. He figured out that the only way he could escape was if he were dead. So he began faking a fatal illness, AIDS. You won't believe the lengths he went through to make his illness look credible. He almost stopped eating and took laxatives to look emaciated and fatigued, mimicking the physical deterioration associated with AIDS. He pulled off the greatest lie of his life, and it worked. Soon, Stephen was confined to his bed and was unable to walk. He required continual medical care. Then, Stephen forged medical reports on a typewriter in the prison library and sent them via internal mail to be attached to his files, creating false documentation of his supposed illness. The prison staff knew he was gay, so they automatically assumed it was natural for him to be diagnosed with the illness. Hence, they accepted the forged documents without question. Stephen also took advantage of the prison's internal communication and medical record systems, ensuring the fake reports were added to his official file without arousing suspicion. Eventually, he was placed on parole for medical grounds, since the prison's medical facilities were unable to offer sufficient care. Once it was proved that he was terminally ill, he was transferred to a hospice to spend the remainder of his life. Now that Stephen was almost free, he just had to pull off a few more tricks to completely fool the authorities. Stephen pretended to be a doctor and contacted his prison's medical unit. He informed the staff that he was looking for test subjects who would aid him in an experimental AIDS treatment, therefore indirectly recommending himself as a volunteer for the trial. This was the perfect escape plan, and he couldn't have picked a better day to escape. It was March 13, 1998, Philip Morris's 39th birthday. Now that Stephen had faked his death and escaped the hospice, All he had to do to solidify his death was forge his death certificate. When the death certificate was received by the prison system, Stephen Russell had officially passed away. He was cleared from the system, so no one was searching for him now. So, where's the one place he would go to? That's right, his long-term lover, Philip Morris. Stephen concocted another plan to meet Morris. Morris was in a prison from where Stephen had previously escaped from. Wearing the dyed prison uniform, so he feared that the staff over there might recognize him. Posing as a judge, he arranged for Morris to be transferred to another prison, where no one would be able to recognize Stephen. Now, pretending to be his lawyer, the couple would routinely reunite during prison visits, though it's exactly how Russell was caught again. To pose as Morris's lawyer, he needed to have a lawyer's ID, which Russell forged himself and got printed from a printing shop. Fortunately, the owner of the printing shop got suspicious of Russell. He reported it to the authorities, who transferred the information to the one and only Terry Cobbs. He was the officer who had previously put him in prison. Terry requested the photo of the man who had printed the lawyer's ID, and it turned out to be Stephen. Cobbs knew Russell was incarcerated and would likely serve many more years, but Terry was confused. He then looked through the prison database and discovered Stephen Russell's parole note. Astonished, Cobbs contacted the prison, wondering how Russell, who was yet to serve his 45-year term, could be on parole. The secretary clarified that Stephen Russell had passed away. Cobbs kept a lookout for Russell, who had put a stop on his prison visits to Morris, likely to avoid suspicion. Soon afterwards, Russell was again in need of money, so he tried to take a loan of $75,000 from a Dallas bank, pretending to be an affluent millionaire. The management reported the suspicious activity to the FBI. But then Stephen realized that they were suspecting him. He pretended to have a heart attack. When the authorities arrived, he had disappeared. He was put under surveillance at the hospital, but Stephen immediately called them from his hospital bed, posing as the police, and instructed them that there was no need for surveillance anymore. However, he made the mistake of leaving some of his fake documents in the hospital. Terry Cobbs used the information on his documents to track down Stephen. He anticipated that Stephen would contact another insurance company and therefore alerted them and sent the police. On April 5, 1998, Stephen Russell was sent back to prison for the last time. Since he had made a fool of the authorities multiple times, he was given an extra 99 years in addition to his 45-year sentence. Stephen Russell is still behind bars today. He spends 22 hours of every day in solitary confinement and is only allowed outside for only 1 hour. After being freed in 2006, Philip Morris now resides alone in Arkansas. He never visited Stephen. Despite his fate, Russell's story is truly fascinating. He was a man who, despite his flaws and criminal activities, managed to captivate the public's imagination. His story is a reminder of the lengths to which people will go for love and freedom. Stephen's life story has been a source of books, news articles, TV shows, and even a feature film starring Jim Carrey and Ewan McGregor. It's called I Love You, Philip Morris. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to Breakout Bank for more videos.